Hi everyone, welcome to today's seminar. So we are happy and honored today to have Rebecca Dirnfeld, who is a career educator, working with the Career Center UBC to support graduate students. She has rich experience in leading the graduate student career education portfolio, and she is an old friend of IRES. We've invited her to our seminar series last year to talk about how to leverage the opportunities of grad school. And today she'll be talking about skills to make her interviews successful. So let's welcome Rebecca. Thank you. Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you for being here. Great to see so many folks in the room. Really appreciate your time. Won't take longer than an hour for today's session. I'll be speaking for about half an hour and then we'll get to Q&A. Hopefully have some engaging discussion with the group. I will ask you just to sign in to let us know you're here. You should see this workshop on your screen when you do sign in. You just enter your UBC student number and then can enter return at your keyboard. And just let me know if that's not working. And I'll see if I can make this, sorry, this, I can just do that so it doesn't affect our screen. See. And for those of you online, hopefully you can hear me. And if you can also just sign in online as well. I'll just give folks a minute to do that, and then we'll get started. Any problems? These are working. Yeah, okay, awesome. Okay, great. Okay, and if you aren't able to do this now, we can always come back to this at the end of the session. It's all kept confidential through our center, just so we can keep track of who's here. So over the next 30 minutes, I want to talk about what employers are really listening for in interviews. Again, or I should say, I'm not someone who's actively hiring right now, so I don't want to speak on behalf of every employer that is out there. All employers will function a bit differently in terms of what they look for, but I feel from the years of experience that I've had and what we hear from recruiters and employers that come to our campus and my own experiences in applying for jobs and interviewing. I have some ideas here that I want to share with you. I also want to talk about how you can think about translating your research, your coursework and experiences into real professional strengths. And also then how can you build a clear interview narrative that connects grad school to the sector roles you're wanting to apply for. So when an employer asks a question to you, what are they really asking for? These are some things that come to mind for me. They want to know how you think. They want to know how you prioritize, whether that is tasks that you're responsible for, your time, values within the workplace, how you add value. How do you add value to not only their workplace and their mission or goals, but also the industry at large that you are representing as a professional, how you work with other people. That's a big one because there's a lot of candidates applying for a role. And so they have to think not only can you do the job and how you will perform in the job, but how are you going to do that with other people in a team-based environment? And also, why are you interested in this job and in their company? So they know as a candidate, you're applying for more than one position, and that you could probably work in multiple different spaces. But they want to feel important, right? They want to know why you want their job that they're offering you and why their company. And so just keep these in the back of your mind as we go through the next sections, because I find when a lot of people study job postings, they're studying the requirements of the job, and that is important, right? Like you need to know how to do the job. You need to be able to successfully convince them that you can do that job. But when you're answering interview questions, we want to keep in mind that they understand that people who are applying and are being brought in for an interview are capable of doing the work. That's why you've been shortlisted for that interview. So they're going to look at other things beyond just what you can do in terms of the in terms of your competencies for the role. So I want to propose 3 categories here, or 3 areas that we could look into a little more closely. And so I want you to think about interviews are about being, for you as a candidate, clear, relevant, and intentional. And when I think about clarity, I think about explaining things simply to an employer. It doesn't mean that you have to dumb down, your capabilities, but it means, can you explain your competencies with examples in a clear and concise manner? Are the things that you are talking about relevant? Are you focusing on what matters to them, whether it's with regards to what's in the job posting, but also whether you're reading between some lines and you are learning more about what really matters to the company in the space that it is situated in? And are you being intentional? Are you connecting to the goal? Now, the goal is, you can think about the goal as they need someone to do this type of work. So that's one goal. There could be other goals, right? They might want to build or grow. They might be dealing with a restructuring where things have tightened up. Maybe they have let some people go and they're looking to bring someone in with a hybrid of skill sets that can do more than one person's job. That happens a lot now. Are they looking to expand into different markets? So they might be growing within their own sphere or domain, but they might be looking to expand or even overtake what other people are offering in terms of products or services in that space. Are they looking to ensure that they exist for the next 5 years, right? Do they need to continually maintain a source of funding or grant money to stay involved in the work that they do? So intentionality is important, right? We need to understand what their goal is beyond the scope of the job posting. So I want to work through these in a little bit more detail. So when we think about being clear, we can relate that back to employers wanting to understand how you think, right? How do you express clarity in what you provide to them? And also, what does your thinking process look like when you are explaining who you are and what you bring to the table? So part of this is how you communicate, right? Like, can you explain your work without disciplinary jargon? Now, that doesn't mean that you can't use language and terminology relevant to the industry and to the field. That's important. But can you speak in a way that is not always perhaps in an academic sense? If they are not a research-based or academic-based space, can you talk about the research you're doing and your accomplishments without leaning too heavily into the jargon relevant to your field or discipline? How you think can also come across in terms of problems or a problem you were trying to understand or solve. So how many people here are doing a thesis or a dissertation as part of their graduate training? Oh, just a few in the room. Okay, so everyone else is in like a professional program? Okay, in your professional masters though, are you working on research papers for your courses, right? Doing maybe literature reviews, but maybe also perhaps doing some novel research, bringing in sources that haven't been looked at before, or rethinking what others have considered, to be truth, or adding to or building to the literature that's been published already. So you're addressing a problem, right? And we want to think about how we do that as individuals. We all do it in similar ways because we're taught from a disciplinary perspective how to do that. And in graduate school, we're often taught similar skills on how to address a problem. But in what ways do you do that that is unique to you? How do you approach it? How do you methodologically think about your approach to problem solving? What steps do you take? And also, what are you drawn to? What problems are you drawn to, and why are you trying to solve them? Another thing to consider is, what was your starting point and how did your thinking evolve? So how many of you have come into grad school approaching certain problems or certain ideas and have had to evolve your thinking around how you approach and how you resolve? Does that resonate with folks? Yeah, how many people, when I don't know, for the professional based masters, you do have to include probably a statement of interest. For the graduate students who are doing masters and PhDs, so you do have to propose a research project. Has that shifted for anyone from when they first came into grad school in terms of what they were interested in or proposed to look at or want to become a professional at or in, versus now that you've been involved in your program? Has anything evolved for you there in terms of any changes to what you thought you were going to be doing or hoping to do and where you're at now? Any folks, or is everything stayed kind of static for? No, not seeing as many nodding heads. So maybe for most people in the room, it's been maybe what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe things have not changed too much as you've gone through. Certainly for me as a grad student, multiple times over, there has been evolution in how my thinking, my learning has happened. And you might want to tap into that, like look into that. Maybe you're not as perhaps aware or conscious of how those shifts are happening, but it's important and interesting to employers to understand how that process has evolved for you. Another thing to consider, if you had 30 seconds, what would you say is the core of your experience around how you think? I don't know if you've ever thought about that. Like, what would be at the core of your thinking process when it comes to problem solving, trying out new ideas, taking initiative? Has anyone ever thought of that before? What might be at the core where it starts, right? Okay, so for some of you nodding, yes, which is great. How would you describe that or explain that to someone who doesn't know you? And then another thing to think about is, what decision-making process did you use when things were uncertain? So for grad students, again, especially if you're doing, graduate research, but also even in professional-based programs, you might hit some barriers or walls around uncertainty. Maybe it's lack of knowledge, maybe new ideas, maybe new concepts being brought to the table, or maybe you're doing this from a different disciplinary lens or perspective than when your undergrad had taken you. And you might have had to make some decision-making, or think about decision-making processes when you were facing uncertainty. So these are all things that employers may look at when they're asking you for clarity around your examples, around your ability to articulate what you bring to the table. Yes.
Sorry, if I can go back to the third point about the starting point, I'm just already trying to. So I think the evolving idea is more on the experience in different geographical locations.
Okay.
Not in Canada, but I'm applying for
Sure.
in Canada. So how do I have to start with that?
Okay, so I think what you're asking is perhaps your starting point was actually like a physical space. Like your starting point might have been coming to Canada and starting here as a grad student, or maybe your starting point was back home in a different.
So I did my master in another country, and
Yeah.
I had work experience in other countries as well.
Okay.
But this is the first time I'm in Canada, and how do I start with that?
Well, that could be your starting point of where your thinking evolved, right? It may have evolved in one way in another country, in either home country where you grew up, where you were culturally invested in, where you were taught by certain intellects and thinkers in that space. And then you came to Canada, maybe it was a new starting point, or maybe your thinking evolved from your starting point back home into where you are right now. So you can be creative with this process, right? And actually, if you do bring international experience or education, this is something you definitely want to bring into the conversation with employers. Because if they're bringing you in as a shortlisted candidate, that could be one of the reasons why, right? That you're bringing an international lens or perspective, or that they're impressed with the fact that you decided to shift from one geographical space to another, and maybe also your disciplinary understanding of that field has shifted or evolved, right? I don't want to say necessarily shifted, you're building, right? In a new cultural and disciplinary space. I hope that helps answer. And we will have a Q&A later as well, just so it's totally fine to ask the question, but because sometimes it's in the moment, right? Yeah. Okay, let's move on to relevancy. So what you prioritize. So when employers are listening to interview answers, they want you to address the questions. That's the most important thing, right? You want to answer the question they're asking. But they're also going to be thinking about some of these questions, which is, why is this experience that you are prioritizing in answering an interview question relevant for the role or the sector, right? So this might seem common sense, like they're asking you a question, you're answering the question. You're obviously going to choose relevancy or something as relevant as possible to answer your interview question. But we don't always explain why when we answer a question. Okay, so you feel free to take the opportunity to be explicit about why you're using a certain experience or certain example to answer an interview question. You want to make it, again, this goes back to clarity, as clear as possible for your listener. So if you feel when you're looking at a job posting that your experience is related, but maybe more indirectly related to the role, then it's up to you to clarify to your listener, so to the interviewer, why is this most relevant? Why are you pulling this up for them to listen to in your interview answer? And this is helpful to think about ahead of time. You don't always know what the interview questions will be, but you do know what experiences you're probably going to lean into when you are being asked interview questions. So think about how you might frame the why for them in that. That could be built into your answer. It could be very clear at the beginning. I'm sharing this example for this reason, explain the reason, and then share the example. So again, what are you choosing to focus on and why? Maybe that's a little bit, maybe that's not necessary to have that second bullet because that's pretty similar to the first one. Which skill from this experience would matter most to this employer? This is another important one. When they are listening to your examples, the example is important because they want to understand the context of where you did what you did, how you accomplished your goals in that space. They might put weight onto what that context is, like was this in an academic environment? Was it in a workplace environment, an internship? Was it in a lab? Was it in a leadership role or volunteer experience? So context matters to them, but skills also matter, right? So one thing that you want to think about is, if you're applying to positions and the experience you have is maybe not exactly what you think they're going to put weight on, right? And that's not to say your experience isn't important, but say the job posting is emphasizing, ideally this candidate has 1 to 2 years of industry-based experience, but you're still applying because you have graduate training, which should equate to years of experience in the labor market. But your experiences are more in an academic space, right? They're in the university setting. Maybe they weren't paid experiences. Maybe you didn't have a manager overseeing your work from 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. That is okay, but you really want to pull out the skill, right? The skill or skill development that came out of that experience. So they're not sitting there thinking, oh, well, the other candidate did this, but in a workplace environment. If you can emphasize the value and the benefit of this skill, then that can overshadow where the experience was. And again, that's not to say experience in an academic space is not as valuable or as important, but we never know what the employer's perspective might be. And then what does this example reveal about what you consider to be important? So this is another thing you can build into your interview answers. So if you're sharing why this is relevant, what are the important skills that have come out of this, you can also share why is this important? Why do you see this as important for the employer in terms of you being an asset to them? Again, I think this really comes back to clarity. And often when I'm doing mock interview sessions with students or graduates, and even when we hire our associate career advisors over the last few years, I've been joining up with my colleague who supervises them to interview them. So different than an industry-based role, this is work learn, if anyone's familiar with work learn positions. But it's very clear from when I listen to interview answers that people don't usually touch upon these things. They really zone in on the example, right? And they hope the listener will be able to pull from the example what they need in order to mark off whatever's on their checklist or in order to ensure that they have what is required for the job. So if you can make this, build this in to your interview answers, they'll be more robust and you will stand out more to your listener. And then intentionality, so how do you add value? So a couple of guiding questions here for you to think about. What did you contribute that wouldn't have happened otherwise? I really like this question because I think it challenges us to think, if I wasn't there doing that work, would it have gotten done? That's one thing you could think about. Maybe you just wouldn't have gotten done. I was hired to do it. I had to do it. What else though? What wouldn't have happened if you hadn't pursued this type of degree and written that thesis? What wouldn't have happened if you didn't participate in a particular leadership role, bring other students together, and so on? So what did you contribute that wouldn't have happened otherwise? Or what outcome changed? Did something shift or change or evolve because of your involvement? how did your work support a larger goal? So it doesn't just have to be something you initiated, achieved, and did all on your own. It could be being part of a larger picture. Get to in one moment, yeah. So were you part of a project, team, organization, or community? What insight, recommendation, or improvement emerged from your work? These are all, questions to think about when you are answering interview questions. This really speaks to that. If you write STAR statements, which I'm sure most of you know about, the situation, task, action, result, this is really the result piece of that. And how would you apply this experience in a new context? So how could this benefit in a new context? Because you understand what you contributed, what changed because of you being involved, how you supported a larger goal or improved something. I saw a hand in the back. I'm happy to just take questions as we go, if that's okay with everyone, because sometimes it's important in the moment. So yes.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, you maybe have very basic examples where like past one goes, I think, someone like Helen can say like two products with grace or the right brothers who invented an airplane with adults, happens with the beach.
Okay.
For people like the normal people maybe.
The normal people, yeah. Majority of the people do that.
Yeah. Much of it even maybe also some.
Right. I hear what you're saying. So you might be thinking, and maybe I don't want to assume in behalf of the room, but you might be thinking, what if there wasn't some big thing, right? Like, what if I didn't innovate on something or, use my entrepreneurship skills or whatever? What if, like, I'm going to class, I'm doing my work, I'm getting through my degree, which is what you're supposed to be doing as a grad student, right? So part of this is about intellectual thought, and everyone here will have in some way a contribution of intellectual thought, whether they've applied it in the present or they will apply it in the future. So I guess I will pose it back to you, and you can nod or whatnot, but as a group, do you feel that because of what you're doing as a grad student, you've tapped into intellectual thought processes that have shifted for you or changed or are evolving in ways that maybe are unique from your perspective, whether it's perspective of where you come from, a perspective of what you're learning, the strengths you bring to the table, what you've learned before? Is anyone having, you guys don't have to be humble and shy, you can be honest here, you're grad students. If it's not happening for you, then I encourage you, the first thing to do is tap into that. Where is that happening if it is happening? Because that is a contribution, right? You might not be applying it directly in the moment. You might not be exercising on it now, but how can you or will you use that in a future space? This is something to think about when you're looking at a job posting. When you're reviewing a job posting and they're asking you, this is what you have to do in the job. Most of us will think, okay, I could do that or most of it, and then they'll train me and I'll evolve as a professional. But how many of us look at that and say, I could do this and I could do it in these various ways because I think a certain way, or I have a certain skill set that I can apply that would lead to the outcome they want, or maybe outcomes A, B, or C. Has anyone tried that before? Like as an exercise for the job posting? It's a really useful exercise. Most of us don't. Most of us look at the posting, we read it at face value, and we think, okay, I can do this, or I can be trained in it. But if you review a job posting and you think, okay, there's different ways I could approach the responsibilities of this role, and what would my approach look like? What would improve? Like you can think into the future though, right? Like what would improve because of that approach? And if you have examples of how you've done that before, then bring those into the picture. And your examples don't have to be revolutionary, right? I'm sure all of us can think to some degree how we have created more positive outcomes because of the work we're doing, whether it's in a classroom, whether it's through our work experience, whether it's through volunteer work. If I were to pose to the room, can folks think of outcomes that have improved because of their past or current educational experiences or involvement in some capacity in something at UBC? How many people would put hands up? Yeah? Okay, good. Again, don't have to be shy. Not a lot of people did. And I'm curious as to why. You don't have to answer that question, but think about that, because that's something that's self-awareness, right? Like, is your why because you haven't identified it yet? Is your why because right now you're more you're in more of a learning mode, so you're learning from others, but you're not necessarily considering what the contributions may look like or be. And if that's the case, you might question, do I need to get more involved? Do I need to exercise on this a little bit more so that I do have something that I can speak to around contribution? I know that's tricky in a professional grad program because it goes by so quickly and you're not working on a specific project that you can speak to, like a thesis, right? Is anyone doing an internship or a capstone something, right? Okay, so that's where this may happen, right? Okay, you might not have done that yet. But I do think it's worthwhile thinking about this carefully because the one thing nowadays I would say with grad school, and I say nowadays because many more people over the last, like say, I don't know, even 20 or 30 years are accessing grad programs. There's many more of them out there. And what used to be more of a thesis-based program has now become thesis or professional-based programs. Employers will not understand what every program is giving you, right? They will see it on your resume. You may talk about your cover letter, but they have not gone through that experience, right? Most likely. I mean, it's not possible because there's just hundreds and hundreds of these programs out there. So it's your job to explain what this looks like, the added value from graduate training, right? We can't assume that they will know what that's going to be. Does that help kind of answer your question a little bit? Oh yeah, okay. Okay, so also something else to consider I want to add here, interviews are rarely about solo brilliance, they're about professional judgment and context. So this is hopefully something that maybe you can speak to right now a little bit more because you're in a grad program with other people. So who did you work with and what roles did they play? Notice I wrote what roles did they play, right? So it's not just what you did, but what did other people in group projects, engagement with faculty, or other activities, what roles did others play? What roles did you play in that? How did you adapt your communication for different audiences? Something to think about when you're answering your interview questions. What tensions or disagreements or trade-offs came up and how did you handle them? This really speaks to if they're asking you about, you know, how do you deal with conflict, right, in the workplace? How did you balance your independence or independent learning and doing with collaboration? And what did you learn about working across disciplines, sectors, or perspectives that you did so if you're engaged in an interdisciplinary space, or maybe your research or your experiences are beyond the scope of just one discipline. So I'm posing these all as questions because I think it is useful, I hope it's useful, and you're welcome to have these slides after to answer these questions. Like actively sit down and answer these questions. See if you can answer them. What do your answers look like? Because that's the data or the information you can take to build into interview responses. And if you feel that you're not happy with those answers, then keep working on them, right? Or locate the gaps for yourself of what do you need to be doing or experiencing in order for these to be answered. And finding opportunities at UBC or elsewhere to do so. Okay, so I want to jump into just briefly translating research course learning experiences to professional strengths. I just have a simple slide here. There might be some questions later around this, which is fine. So, and we can add to this, but I have what you might be doing during grad school and how this may become a professional strength. So these are some examples of how you might want to think about answering questions or pulling from examples in a way that uses language that's more zoned in from the professional perspective. So if you're choosing courses, I don't know how many folks have the option of choosing electives or courses, or they're just kind of given to you in professional programs. Sometimes it's like you have to take these courses. You might be choosing other opportunities or experiences, but if it's course selection, the professional strength, or if these courses are being given to you, is it's giving you technical and analytical foundations in your learning. And as a professional, if you do have a research focus, even if that's for coursework where you're using an assignment to zone in on research focus, you're engaging in problem framing and depth of something, of a topic or a method. If you are using different methods in grad school, these are going to be very much so transferable skills. So methods could be technological, they could be intellectual methods you're using. You need to think about, so I left this open-ended, but you need to think about what does that mean in terms of transferability of skill. So let me pose to you folks, what might be a method that someone is using in grad school to complete research, coursework? Otherwise, what are some methods that you're engaging in? Academic methods, the methodology, it could be technologies, tools, yeah.
Like surveys, like public communications.
Okay, let's use that one, that's great, surveys, and so you said surveys, public communication, like to ask people to answer questions or answer surveys so you can get data, right?
Yeah.
Is that the idea? Okay, so. And it's not just on you, but what might this look like as transferable skills in the professional strengths domain? Yes, let's work together like one brain, okay, yes. Engaging with the public, excellent, so it could be public, like your client, you know, that could be like client facing. It could be even like if you think your respondents are almost like stakeholders in some way, maybe not, maybe you have other types of stakeholders, but great, okay. What other transferable skills? Yes.
Communicating ideas.
Beautiful, knowledge transfer, communication of ideas, right? You have to send that survey out in a way that's going to be responded to because. For lack of a better term, the layperson understands, right, what that survey is about, exact, beautiful. What else? Lots more. What else is transferable here? What else can we think of? That might be a professional strength, yeah.
Like organization, companies and things.
Okay, tell me a little bit more, like what do you mean by that, like when it comes to survey, I don't do this, so I want to hear from you guys, so. When you're doing this type of work, what does organization entail in this space?
Think about this, just like a whole bunch of that, and like in the professional space, if you're like getting a lot of things coming at you, you need to be
Yeah.
just like organize it appropriately, so then
Beautiful.
build on each one.
Love it. Prioritization of what's coming in. How are you organizing it? Okay, that goes back to approach, right? How do you, that's a problem, right? How do you approach the problem? How do you, and you might do it differently from someone else, right? But there's a method to that, right? Beautiful, love it. See a hand in the back.
I was gonna talk about guideline, and not to submit something before you go to survey.
Mm-hmm.
Some understanding of the institution, which is that.
I love that. So protocol adherence, excellent, beautiful. Sorry, mindful of my time. This is great. I love the engagement here, but we're kind of doing Q&A together. So I hope that's okay with the presentation. So protocol, yeah, like you might need to do ethics, right? Like maybe get, what's the word I'm looking for? Like approved, right? Now, employers may understand or not understand that, or might look different in their space. You want to explain that further, right? But you following protocol. I love that. Following guidelines, being an ethical professional, and so on. Love that. So we probably only just touched the tip of the iceberg for that, right? But think about the methods you're using. What does that mean about transferable skills, right? And then when you're using clarity, explain that in your interview answers. Like if you want to use that survey as your example, well, be clear about skills, right? Be clear about what that means for your value add as a professional in your interview answer. Like make it as clear as possible for your listener. So projects and partnerships leads to what can be applied experience in a professional strength, or decisions you made is can be aligned with judgment and owners, like taking ownership of decisions you made. And this can continue on. So you can create your own during grad school. I'm doing all of this. What does that mean when it comes to a professional strength? Okay, and everyone's list is going to look different, which I think is really cool. Because you may all be in a similar program or type of program, but you're not all going to be doing the same thing day in and day out. Okay, so just briefly a bit about building a clear interview narrative. So how many people have heard of STAR statements? That's probably a lot of people heard. Okay, so I do have an example here. But as you identify your professional strengths, like we talked about in the previous slide, start to plan out STAR statements. So this is the next step, right? So you may start with, this is what I'm doing in grad school. These are the professional strengths I'm identifying. How would I explain this with clarity, with intention, like going to those earlier slides? And then think about, okay, what are the examples that back this up, right? And so I have an example here. It might be a bit hard to read, but instead of my thesis, look at climate adaptation policy. Okay, like obviously, I don't think anyone would answer an interview question just with that statement, but for sake of, an example. But you could instead say, oh, and I should say what the STAR statement is, just in case folks aren't familiar, stands for situation, task, action, result. So what you're trying to do here is work through a job posting, keeping in mind what I've shared with you already, and then thinking about if I were to address these requirements of the job, either line item by line item, or I'm grouping them into different categories because there's some repetition between what they want from me throughout the job posting. Then you start to think, well, what star statements could I use to speak to my relevancy to that? And you want to think about, okay, what was the situation I was in, the context, what was I responsible for doing or accomplishing, what action did I take? That's really where those skills come into play. And what was the positive outcome or the result? What value did I add? What happened that wouldn't have happened if I didn't do it? So my research examined how municipal climate adaptation policies are implemented across departments. I analyzed policy documents, interviewed stakeholders, and synthesized findings to identify barriers to coordination. One outcome was a set of recommendations that can improve cross-department collaboration, which helped me develop strong skills in policy analysis, stakeholder engagement, and translating research into actionable insights. Now, I'm not going to say this is the best, star statement that ever existed, but it's just an example, right? So hopefully you can see where the situation was. This is what the research was on. This is what the person did. I did X, Y, and Z. These were my tasks. These are the actions that I took. Also, an action is like, this is what I did, but also this is how I did it. I analyzed these documents, I interviewed, I synthesized findings, and then the results. One of the outcomes was this. And also at the end of the statement, what I like is they made it very clear to the interviewer, this is what I developed, right? Like you can do that. Don't be shy to do that. This is where I see the strong skills in action from what I did. Okay, so what does this achieve overall? So your grad experience versus what the employer need here. If you talk about your thesis research in an effective way, like we've talked about, especially if you're using STAR statements, they're going to see problem solving and synthesis. If you're talking about mixed methods as a grad experience to get your work done, they'll see analytical or hear analytical and qualitative rigor. If you talk about being involved in group projects, they're going to see collaboration and communication, community engaged work. If you're involved in that, they'll see or hear stakeholder awareness. And if you're engaging in independent research, they're going to see or hear ownership and initiative. But again, it's up to you to make that as clear as possible to them through your answers and clarity in interview responses. So I encourage you as a next step to identify 2 to 3 graduate anchored experiences that you have. When I call them anchor experiences, think about what are things that come to mind that you feel anchored in as experiences where any of what I talked about today has happened, right? Like intellectual development, application of learning, using methods like we just did as an example. Practice translating this out loud. I know that sounds a little silly, but it's one thing to write this in a document like a resume and send that off into the universe to hopefully get a response. But it's another to actually articulate it in your own words, to verbalize it. And we do mock interview practice at the Career Center. And I think it's a very effective tool because it's a safe space. There's no judgment. You probably, if it's your first time coming in, you won't even know us. Like, you're just on Zoom or in person sitting in front of, staff member of UBC and you're trying it out and we'll give you feedback. Look for alignment between projects and roles you're curious about. You may not actively be looking at jobs right now, some of you might be, but if you're not, if you're in the middle of your program, still review job postings. It's a nice research project when you have time to see where there's the alignment. Like start to think about this now and start to document, and then use interview practice as conversations about fit and not test. You're not being tested, but we're trying to identify if you're fitting in with the workplace in terms of if you can do the work and also if you're the right fit for the role in that environment space. So I'm done my presentation now. I'm going to open it up if there are more questions to folks, and I'm happy to answer. Yes.
First of all, thank you for sharing all this